Chapter 6, Nuts and Bolts of Obedience Training. One way to think about macro criteria setting is to think about what grade the dog is in a given subject. If your dog is in kindergarten or grade 1 on sits day, he will flunk a test at the grade 12 or PhD level. This is not malice, revenge, spite, or stubbornness. It's just how animals learn. The following sequences for teaching sit stay, down stay, stand, come, heel, don't jump, and don't pull are organized by increasing level of difficulty from kindergarten through to the college and PhD level. Before training any of these, charge up your clicker, the condition reinforcer, as described above. The detailed sequences in this chapter use prompt fade or prompt drop procedures. For details on training prompt free and later adding cues, there is no better resource I have found than Karen Pryor's Don't Shoot the Dog. Kindergarten sit. Put a treat in the palm of your hand and cover it with your thumb so it stays in. Allow the dog to sniff this goodie. Ascertain if he is targeting the treat by moving your hand around. Does he try to follow the hand? If yes, he is targeting and you may now proceed to lure a sit. Move the treat slowly over the dog's head, high enough that he must crane his neck back to continue targeting, but not so high that he jumps to target. Move the treat backwards over the dog slightly, maintaining the same height. Then just wait. If the dog jumps or backs up, remove the target for an instant and start over. Most dogs will eventually sit to make it more comfortable to continue targeting the treat. As soon as the dog sits, click and give him the treat. Imagine that the dog is training you to open your hand by sitting. Repeat this 3 or 4 times. The dog should sit with less and less effort from you with the target. Your hand gesture can now be executed quickly with your palm facing up. This paves the way for the hand signal you're about to train. Now put a morsel of food in your pocket or in your other hand behind your back. You will now use your empty hand as a target for giving a broad, clean, confident hand signal to sit. The hand signal is an upward scoop with palm open. Always conceptualize sit as an attempt to get the dog's head up rather than getting the rear end down. If you get the head up and back, the rear takes care of itself. When the dog sits, immediately click and give him the food reinforcer from your other hand or pocket. This stage is very, very important. It reinforces the notion that the dog's behavior produces the reinforcer and that this does not have anything to do with whether the reinforcer was visible or not, as a lure. Our goal, in fact, is for him to learn that not seeing lure is more predictive of reinforcement than seeing one. It is vitally important that the dog learn the blank hand is better than the one with the food in it. For the novice dog, this is like a leap into the unknown. Many initially sit for blank hands in a manner that looks as though they think, well, this couldn't possibly work, but I'll try anyway. You have to make them believers by reliably reinforcing responses to empty-handed signals. This is contrary to the human inclination to dispense reinforcers that are already loaded into hands as lures. This is such a critical juncture in training. Failure to get reliable response with the reinforcer invisible sets you up for a possible lifetime of a dog who only does it when I have food in my hand. Practice until the dog sits as reliably for the empty-handed signal as he did for the original lure. If the dog balks at any stage for the blank hand, don't crack and put food back into it. Simply wait and reinforce the sit when you finally get it. You'll need to train in a low competition environment initially to achieve this. When the response for the blank hand is very snappy, you may tighten the quality control if you like. Select the better sets. This may mean faster, cuter, or neater. It's up to you. When the dog is still sitting enthusiastically exactly as you'd like him to when in a low competition environments, such as at home, go on to the next step. The next step is to do some distraction proofing. Load up a zipped sealed snack bag with 10 or 12 food treats that are a little nicer than what you had been using for the initial installation. Put the bag in your pocket, ready to dispense, and then go somewhere with the dog. It can be out on the usual walk or on a car errand to the grocery store, at Starbucks while reading the Sunday paper, anywhere except where there are dogs. Hang out at your chosen place until he stops swimming around, sniffing the ground and checking out the sights and sounds. This might take a couple of minutes or possibly longer. Once he starts checking in with you or looking bored, practice sits with your empty hand signal, reinforcing each one until all your treats are gone. Then go home, do it again. In the same place a day or two later. How did he do? Did he offer any sits before you started signaling? Did he get bored with the environment faster? You can also practice cold sits while on his regular walks. Load up your baggie with half a dozen treats and at random times on the walk, signal sit, reinforcing whenever he does it. When he doesn't do it, stop walking and wait until he attends to you, then try again. Once he sits for the signal, dispense a treat and then continue the walk. This is a double reinforcer. He got a treat and he got you moving again. This exercise is very good for the sit works personal philosophy you're trying to build in him. Although deceptively simple, taking a behavior on the road for location generalization, the practice is gold. Most dogs get pretty sharp after just a couple of outings and can then be worked in progressively more difficult surroundings. You can include any places or contexts you'd like the dog to be responsive in, leaving the heavy competition, dogs and small furries, for later. If you want the dog to be obedient everywhere, practice in as many places as you can. Once you've done some preliminary proofing, it's time to associate the word sit to the behavior by saying sit before you give the hand signal. The word sit is the new part, so it will go first in the sequence. Go back to low distraction to commence this exercise. Proof it in your locations once he's reliably sitting on the verbal cue. Here's the sequence. 1. Verbal cue sit. Wait 1 full second. 2. Hand signal. 3. Dog sits. 4. Click. 5. Hand opens and dog gets reinforced. Be careful to say the verbal sit before you give the hand signal, as opposed to simultaneously, as is most people's inclination. Otherwise, the known cue will block the new cue you are trying to establish. The new cue needs to stand in isolation for a full second before you define its meaning to the dog with the known signal. After reinforcing several in a row this way, try the following. Cue sit verbally and wait, with the food treat behind your back or in your pocket. At first, the dog may simply stand or stare at you, whine, bark, paw at you, or try to target the treat in your pocket or behind your back. Simply ignore all this and wait for 20 or 30 seconds. If the dog sits at any point, click immediately and then give him a treat from your pocket or hand. Then do it again. Cue the verbal and wait. If the dog does not sit after 20 or 30 seconds, do one reminder review, the verbal cue followed by hand signal, and then reinforce when he sits. Then give the verbal cue for sit and try the waiting game again. With this stalemate, you are teaching the dog to attend to the verbal cue. Verbal cues are opportunities the dog will eventually learn to not miss. Remain at the stage of training, reinforcing every response to the verbal cue, until the dog sits immediately after every verbal cue to sit. This will fall apart initially when you go cold, giving the verbal cue out of the blue rather than in the context of a training session. If you get nothing after a 20-second stalemate, or if you lose him at any point, do one review with the verbal followed by the hand signal, then repeat with just the verbal. If you get stuck in this pattern, the dog never performs cold for the verbal and always needs the signal review. Do the signal review and praise the response without giving food reinforcement. Then give food to reinforce the sit for verbal cue only. Then make the next trial cool rather than cold. Practice a minute or two after the last successful sit on verbal trial rather than hours or days later, but not immediately after as in a training session. This is a useful gray area between good response in a training session, oh, this is the time when I sit a lot, and real life, what? It is also the one exception to the rapid delivery of trials rule in operant conditioning. Consciously have longer lags between trials for the express purpose of teaching cues. When you get reliable sits on verbal cue, start reinforcing about 50% of the time. This simply means you reinforce about every second time the dog sits on cue. When you do this, by the way, don't do one reinforcer, one skipped in a fixed pattern. Randomize it more. Pick the nicer ones. These nicer ones, your new criteria, will actually be on 100% reinforcement. As soon as the dog is perfect again at this new criteria level, example, winner after winner trial, you go down to 50% reinforcement before making it harder with yet some other variation on how you want it done. When all the criteria have been added, you may wish to go for a maintenance schedule lower than 50%. For now, a thin reinforcement schedule is not necessary. The kindergarten sit is harder than you might imagine, because although staying is not expected yet, the goal is semi-stimulus control over sit, from a stand. In theory, stimulus control means that the dog always sits immediately whenever the verbal cue or hand signal is given. The dog does not sit in the absence of the cue. The dog does not sit when any other cue is given, and the dog does not do any other behavior after the sit cue. In most practical dog training, what we're after is that the dog sits immediately whenever the cue or signal is given. As you'll see, there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle, especially when there are a lot of different cues and behaviors to be learned, and the context is constantly changing. Dog trainers are like jugglers who have a lot of balls to keep in the air. The best place to start this entire process is by teaching a good, solid sit. At this point, you have a dog who sits on both a hand signal and verbal cue. Soon we'll add more proofing. That is, we'll strengthen the responses to the sit cue while you increase distractions, vary your orientation to and distance from the dog, and practice inner cue discrimination. When you proof, you increase reliability. You are teaching the dog that the only ingredient necessary to set up this contingency for sit is the verbal cue or hand signal for sit. You do this by deliberately and systematically varying everything else to prove their irrelevance. A certain location is not necessary, nor is it necessary that the trainer be standing 2 feet away in front of the dog, nor does the dog have to be first standing. All that's needed is the word or signal for sit. The dog does it anytime, anywhere, no special conditions necessary. The dog can tell the sit cue apart from all the others he knows. This is inner cue discrimination. No matter in what order you throw cues at him, he always gets the sit right immediately on the first try. Until now, you haven't practiced inner cue discrimination because sit is the only cue your dog knows. Soon, inner cue discrimination will be one of the balls you must keep in the air. Before we get into proofing, let's get those other basic cues up and rolling so that we can discuss proofing in a more general context. Kindergarten down. The first order of business, as it was for sit, is to repeatedly obtain and reinforce the behavior of the dog lying down. You could simply hang around and wait for the dog to spontaneously lie down. This avoids the prompt fade baggage. You can also prompt down as follows. Sit on the floor with a treat and bend one of your knees so that your leg makes a tunnel. Once the dog is targeting the treat, you will slowly lure him through the tunnel. He will have to lie down to keep his nose and mouth on the treat. If you're struggling with the mechanics of this, an experienced trainer can show you the nuances. As soon as he is in the down position, click and open your hand so that he wins the treat. Repeat this up to a half dozen times. If the dog does not readily target the treat as you move it under your leg, you may be pulling it through too fast. Go slowly, especially for dogs who seem suspicious about crawling under your leg. Let him win a couple of treats for putting his head under before raising the standard to head and shoulders, and finally an actual down. If the dog jumps over your leg to continue targeting on the other side, simply say, "Too bad," and start over again. This behavior will fade if it never works. When the dog is diving readily under your leg to make your hand open, see if he will go down without the tunnel. Many dogs don't even need a tunnel to start with, and you can start them with this exercise. Sit on the floor, no tunnel now, with a treat in your hand. As soon as he's targeting the treat, move it slowly straight down, palm down, between his front paws with your fingers, covering the treat so that it is between your hand and the floor. Then, just wait. He will probably worry at it, licking, gnawing, pawing at your hand. You are simply waiting for him to lie down. Ignore all the other behaviors. They will die if they do not work. Eventually, the dog will lie down. Click right away and open your hand. Then repeat. The second and third time may still be fairly protracted, but most dogs catch on in very few trials thereafter. The dog is simply becoming more efficient. Worrying at your hand with mouth and paws has never worked. See, he more rapidly cuts to the chase and lies down. Lying down, after all, keeps proving to be the best strategy to get that hand to open. Other strategies get ruled out through trial and error. When the dog is instantly lying down as you place your target hand with the treat in it on the floor, you now have the task of dropping the food lure. Before doing this, with the treat in your hand, practice several push-ups using hand signals. Push-ups are sequences of sit down, sit down. If the dog has difficulty moving upwards to a sit from the down position, simply move your target hand with the treat in it, palm up and back slightly, and then freeze. The dog will pop into a sit sooner or later in order to continue targeting. When he does, you simply click and open your hand again. Don't use your verbal sit cue here, as sit from a down is a whole new ballgame from the sit from a stand you've been working on. Through all of this, the dog is not only learning sit and down, he is learning how to learn. Inexperienced dogs must not only learn which behaviors you want and what the signals for these behaviors are, they must learn the concept that there is something quite specific that you want at all. Experienced dogs, the ones with great and instant responses to dozens of cues, learn much more rapidly because they know how the game is played. They try out and abandon behavioral strategies in a fast, efficient manner and pick up what the right option is often after the first click. This flies in the face of popular mythology about young dogs learning more rapidly than older dogs. Naive animals of any age learn more slowly than experienced animals of any age. It is prior education that counts. So, be patient when working on neophyte dogs. Each bit of training is money in the bank. Once the dog is warmed up by doing brisk push-ups over and over with the target in your hand, reinforce these sits and downs 50% of the time over a set or two. Choose the quickest ones. Then, remove the target and show the dog your empty hand. Have a treat ready in your other hand. With your empty hand, give your down signal, palm to the floor, the same way as you have been doing during the push-ups with the treat. Now, wait. If the dog stands, mark the mistake. Too bad. Get him back into a sit and try again. Eventually, perhaps, reluctantly, this couldn't possibly work if the dog lies down. Immediately click and treat. Repeat several times so that the trend emerges. Just as for sit for an empty hand, our goal is for the dog to go down and as easily for the blank hand as he did for the food lure. When that is happening, you may start to reinforce less often, demanding 2, then 3 or more complete push-ups per reinforcement. Then take your push-ups on the road. When your dog will do smooth push-ups for an empty-handed signal in a few different locations, you are ready to add the word down to these proceedings. Go back to low distraction. Before giving the hand signal, say down, and then give the signal as usual. The sequence is 1. Verbal cue, down, wait 1 full second. 2. Hand signal to down. 3. Dog lies down. 4. Click and treat. Your verbal cue will become a reliable predictor of the known signal. After half a dozen repetitions in a row of the sequence, 1. Verbal cue, 2. Hand signal, 3. Correct response, and 4. Reinforcement, try giving the verbal cue and simply waiting. As soon as he lies down, immediately click and furnish. Again, the first few trials might be painfully slow, but you must live through this to get to the other side. A dog who reliably lies down for a verbal cue only. If you lose him, give the verbal cue and then hand signal. Try a smaller one, not as low to the ground as you have been giving, and reinforce to get him back in the game. If you haven't lost him, but he stares interminably, blinking without a shred of a clue what to do, prompt the down with your hand signal and praise, but do not reinforce with food. Then immediately start over, give the verbal and wait. When the down gets smoother for a verbal cue, take it on the road, giving the slightly nicer road reinforcers every time. Elementary school sit and down. Inner cue discrimination. Inner cue discrimination becomes an issue the minute the dog has 2 choices of response, sit and down. What do you, the trainer, do if you cue down and the dog sits? You have 4 main options. One is to mark the behavior, oh, too bad, and then bail the dog out by cueing down again and reinforcing it when you get it. The second option is to simply mark the behavior, oh, too bad, and pause the training by looking away for a few moments or even walking away briefly before starting the next trial. If the dog is hooked on training, as he likely is by this time, this will function as a negative punisher. Interruption of opportunities for reinforcement. Only a correct response on the first try gets reinforced. Try harder. The third option is to mark the boo-boo, prompt the correct response, but withhold the reinforcer since the correct response required this extra help. Again, only a correct response on the first cue gets reinforced. The fourth option is to simply wait, no click, no food, no praise, no mark, nothing, then start another trial after a pause. So which option should you choose? Some are more costly to the dog than others. Knowing what to do in any given circumstance with any given dog is part of the fine art of training. These judgment calls are what separate the adequate from the proficient. Don't agonize about it too much. You'll get better with experience. If you bail the dog out by first marking and then re-cueing the behavior, the dog is likely to guess right on the second or third trial. especially if the discrimination is between only 2 cues. This is okay for beginner dogs because it gives them another chance with little pressure on them. The game is kept easy to win. The disadvantage is that the incentive to not guess wrong in future is low. This comes into play when the discrimination task is harder. Example, when your dog has many responses to choose from rather than just 2. With this training style, if the dog gets it wrong, the worst thing that happens is the chance for a reinforcement is delayed slightly by having to be re-cued after the mark. The second option is tougher. The mistake is identified as such by the mark, too bad, but the dog is not given a second chance. The disruption in training delivery is a small timeout. The idea is to motivate the dog to guess more carefully in future. The stakes are higher. Only correct first guesses are reinforced and thus keeping the flow of training going. Use this option for non-novice dogs. Keen dogs that guess a lot, or if no improvement is gained using option 1 over 2 or 3 sessions. If you use it and the dog checks out, you lose him. Go back to option 1 or crank motivation up and competition down. The third option, to mark the mistake and prompt the right response but withhold the reinforcer, is even tougher. The dog expends calories every time, one way or another, but reinforcement is only given for those responses made on his own by guessing right the first time, as in option 2. If the dog is not keen enough, you will lose him fairly often by training this way. If you're not losing him, this is a nice penalty for guessing. The fourth option, to simply do nothing if the dog guesses wrong, works marvelously with very motivated dogs, but has one drawback. When the animal is on an intermittent schedule, not every correct response is reinforced anyway. Ignoring wrong responses may feel the same to the dog as those unreinforced but correct responses. In early training, this is hard on the learner. For this reason, it is good to praise the dog for the correct responses that go unreinforced so he can tell the difference. Praise helps the dog discriminate between a right response that is unreinforced because of the schedule and a response that is unreinforced because it is wrong. The praise is a signal that the dog is on the right track with that response, whereas the silence means dead end, no way that will ever be reinforced. The same result can be achieved by marking wrong responses, too bad, and ignoring correct responses that are part of the schedule. My advice is to experiment with all these communication options and discover what works best for you and your dog. It is good to have a grasp of all these options so that you can switch strategies if necessary during training. All this talk about the dog guessing may have you wondering how the dog could possibly need to guess between 2 easy cues like sit and down. The answer is that, although dogs learn the behaviors relatively quickly, getting our semi-stimulus control, for example, getting dogs to the level where they never guess wrong, is much, much harder than dog owners imagine. Dogs, when given a cue, typically guess sit, or whatever behavior has received the most reinforcement in the training history to date, cumulative reinforcement, or was blitzed most recently, the latest trick syndrome. Dogs also seem to learn patterns of responses more easily than they learn cues. A classic example of this is a dog who, regardless of what cue is given, performs sit, give a paw, down, roll over in a stereotyped sequence. It is as though order of events learning overshadows the content of the cues. If you want your dog to learn the actual cues, you must continually vary the sequence and penalize guessing. It seems to be the policy of many dogs to notice that they have been given a cue, not tune in to what the cue was specifically, and proceed to guess their way through the repertoire until they stumble onto what the trainer wants. They approach responding to cues with a carpet bombing mentality, whereas we would prefer neat, precise, smart bomb responses. The only viable explanation for this is that the inner-cue discrimination is taxing to them. You, the trainer, must therefore provide adequate incentive for the dog to attend the content of the cues. This is a specific and relatively long-winded training task, especially when the number of responses you have trained piles up. Dogs struggle much more with random order of sequences of multiple cues. They get better at it with practice, but only if a standard is set that demands they get each cue right the first time. This means it behooves you to use as tough a penalty regime for wrong guesses on sit-down discrimination as your dog can tolerate. Every time he gets it right for the verbal reinforce. Do not go to a 50% schedule for this exercise, even once it starts to look good. Discrimination tasks are bettered by continuous reinforcement. The goal is for the dog to do either a sit or a down for the first verbal cue. with no more wrong guesses. Once he can, take it on the road. Now let's get the final position up and running so we can build a three-way cue discrimination, the landmark that, in my opinion, moves a dog out of the novice category. Kindergarten stand. As dogs stand up from a sitting or lying position, they almost invariably take a step or two forward. Your lure and eventually your hand signal will reflect this natural movement. The first step in teaching stand is, as usual, to obtain and reinforce the behavior. To do this without any prompt baggage, you can wait for emitted stands, capture them, and then, once they're at a very high frequency, add a cue. Here's my favorite modus operandi, a prompt drop procedure. The dog is sitting and you have a food target in your hand. Hold the target to his nose and then move it smoothly away from him in a clean horizontal motion. To target the treat, the dog stands. Reinforce once he stands. Don't let him take more steps than necessary to get from a sit to a stand. If the dog has had any stay training, he might not budge, as it might feel to him like a sit-stay proofing exercise. For these stay-savvy dogs, you must briefly press him to do another strategy shift, back to targeting the lure. There are 3 ways to do this. 1, a body prompt to stand. 2, bigger lures or extra verbal prompting. Or 3, simply waiting for the reinforceable response. The body prompt is a gentle finger or two in the dog's groin area, gently lifting upwards. As soon as the dog stands, click and reinforce. Be sure to do the physical prompt after the signal. Usually, only a few physical prompts are necessary to let the dog know that this is not a stay exercise. To verbally prompt, try your release word right after the lure or other encouraging noises to try to get him unlocked from staying. You can also tap your lure hand with your other hand. After a few repetitions, reduce the prompting and wait for the stand after the first lure, reinforcing every instance until it is solidly installed. All this will, naturally, make a temporary mess of your stay, if it started. Don't panic. The dog will learn to discriminate a stand cue from a sit or down stay, and get better at this sort of task in the process. To do this, you may want to oscillate between sit-stay and stand from a sit trials to improve the dog's discrimination between these 2 cues. Then do the same thing with down stay and stand from a down. If stay has not been started, the stand installation should go without a hitch. Once the dog is standing readily from a sit for a food target, teach him to stand from a down. This is trickier than stand from a sit, but is made easier by the fact that the dog has learned to stand from a sit already. Use the same prompts. When he's standing with greater abandon from either a sit or a down, work to obtain this response for a hand signal only, just as you did for sit and down. The food lure goes back into your pocket or other hand. You may go to a physical and verbal prompting temporarily if the behavior falls apart. Reinforce every empty-handed stand until he's smooth at this. Then take it on the road for nicer treats. When the dog performs stand without mistakes or hesitation for an empty-handed signal, cold and in your desired locations, you may start installing the verbal cue. You will probably have to signal and prompt quite a few after giving your verbal cue before weaning off these crutches. The sequence is 1. Verbal cue, stand, wait 1 full second. 2. Hand signal and or food lure for stand. 3. Dog stands. 4. Click and treat. Remember that stand from a sit and stand from a down are 2 separate exercises, so work on them separately. When the dog masters the stand with only a verbal cue from either a sit or a down, it's time for the 3-way. High school positions. 3-way cue discrimination. This is an important foundation exercise in obedience training. Can the dog reliably, on the first cue, perform a sit, down, or stand from any position? Can he do it for verbal cues only? The 3-way exercise is harder than the earlier sit versus down discrimination because, in that exercise, when the dog is already in a down, the next thing asked for is always going to be a sit. If he's already in the sit, the next cue will surely be down. Dogs learn, in other words, to do the other one. You can, in fact, avoid this by throwing in trick questions, cueing another down when the dog is already down. But it's much more efficient to simply add a 3rd position. Adding that 3rd position, the stand, changes everything. This is where dogs really get the concept that the cue means something very specific, and this is where the trainer gets good at acquiring semi-stimulus control. Practice sit, down, and stand in random order for verbal cues. Pause briefly between each cue to stimulate anticipation. Make him stick with his first guess rather than bombarding you with volume positions. Help with a hand signal when the dog does nothing or is incorrect, but deliver praise only, no food, when you have to help him. Fast delivery helps, as always. Reinforce only those responses where the dog guesses right first try, without the added hand signal. We are banking that the dog can tolerate this amount of penalty. You'll know if he can't. You will either lose him or his performance will get worse secondary to flustering or frustration. Note weaknesses. Typical initial weaknesses include the sit from a down from a stand, and stand from a down. These particular changes often need to be drilled on their own. Practice the same change until it is performed smoothly and then reintegrate it into the random order exercise. This is fairly painstaking work, but well worth it for the gains you reap in terms of the dog's understanding of basic positions and the learning to learn effect. This puts you in good stead for everything else you ever plan to teach your dog. Once initial weaknesses are ironed out, many dogs will still perform seemingly at chance the first few sessions. Keep practicing. If you got him motivated and he gets clearly above chance by the 4th or 5th session, all is well. If not, back off. Choose one change. Sit from a down for instance and do a few reinforced reps of verbal followed by hand signal. Then try with just the verbal. If he does nothing or guesses wrong, penalize this with a too bad, pause in the training, and then try again. If he blows it again, signal the right response and reinforce when he does. Then push again by penalizing guessing. The right balance between pushing for the dog to get it right on his own and backing off on the standard to keep the dog in the game differs for every dog. The principle, to not hang out endlessly at the same level and to not lose or frustrate the dog, is always the same. An appropriate goal for a trainer is to keep progress going while never losing the dog. This means you've learned to drop the standard before you lose the dog, and yet you keep inching up criteria for reinforcement. This will keep the dog playing the game and maximize progress in the particular exercise, all the while cultivating his growing addiction to the game itself. Making the game too easy results in a minimalist approach from the dog. There can be some real legwork to training a reliable three-way position discrimination. Although some dogs seem to make dramatic breakthroughs in their percentage right, for many dogs the percentage of right guesses inches up gradually over the long haul. Don't try the distance work until the dog has a very first guess right always three-way with you a couple of feet away. College. Positions at a distance. The change in picture when the handler is farther from the dog can cause massive generalization problems. We tend to do all our interacting with dogs, including training, at very close range. One of the key elements in the package is that most reinforcers are, quite naturally, transferred from trainer to dog up close. The repeated association of close to handler equals high probability of reinforcement, while far from handler equals low probability of reinforcement. Contributes to behavior falling apart when you get more than a few feet away. The dog is seeking both the familiar up-close picture and anticipating the collection of reinforcers as has happened in the past, up close. This culminates in creeping of the dog, edging toward you on each position change. The reinforcer collection anticipation misbehavior of organisms effect can be attenuated by frequently tossing primary reinforcers a distance from the dog, as described below, in early training. Overcoming the distance obstacle is a major breakthrough in the dog's generalization of any cue he has learned. It's as though he has the revelation. Hey, you mean sit works at 20 feet too? Amazing. Getting there is like any other training task. You must set a standard that the dog can already achieve sometimes, so you can win the game right off the bat and gradually crank it up, provided he continues to play the game and make progress. If you get position changes at a distance, it paves the way for other behaviors you would subsequently like to have at a distance. A good warm-up for this is to practice your three-way discrimination up close, but with a varied cue picture. During training, dogs attend to more than cues. The location of training, the trainer's distance, posture, body language, and orientation are all salient elements in what's called the stimulus package. Our goal is to vary everything except the cue itself. So make him do position changes while you sit in an easy chair, flipping treats across the room for collection after the click. So he starts to get unhooked from the idea that being up close to you is necessary for reinforcer collection. Practice position changes while he is in his crate. Practice with you lying on the couch or on the floor. Practice with your back to him, using a mirror to watch his responses. All of this helps the dog find out that regardless of how the picture changes, the cue always means the same thing: doing the behavior earns him a treat. If he gets stuck and starts cranking out losers, have the new, tricky picture predict a more familiar picture for a couple of trials. For instance, if he can't stand from the down when you're lying down and giving cues, give the cue lying down, wait a second, and then prompt by sitting up and giving him a hand signal. Reinforce this once or twice. Push for him to jump the prompt by stalemating on the third trial. When you've got these in the bag, distance will come much more readily. In spite of good prep, many dogs will tend to creep forward in early distance training. I strongly suggest you prevent this mechanically. There are a number of ways to accomplish this. One is to work him while he is in a crate or X pen. After each nice, successful run of reinforced position changes, you take one step backwards. The dog learns that he can make you approach the crate or pen and reinforce him by executing correct changes on cue. Putting him behind some barrier, like a baby gate or fence, is equally effective. You can work with him at the top of a flight of stairs or a natural inhibitor of forward motion. You can put him on a leash and tether him to a post. This affords you the added generalization bonus of the dog doing changes with the sensation of the constant pressure of the tether. A lot of dogs initially fall apart when you do this. I can't possibly lie down with this tether on. And then learn after some training, well, hell, I guess I can. Increase distance gradually and spend time working through any mental blocks, such as the tethering one. One wall you may hit usually occurs at around 8 to 10 feet, especially if you are working on hand signals as well as verbal cues. It could be that the signal looks different when you reach that particular distance, or it might just be the distance at which the training gravity loses its hold and you are on truly novel ground. Who knows? Once you get past this, things seem to go more smoothly. The transition from 10 to 30 feet comes much more easily than the transition from 2 to 10 feet. Whenever he's right, go in and reinforce. Failure to do so muddles the discrimination task and supports the reinforcers are more likely up close idea you're trying to weaken. If you've got a good arm, flip the treats behind him, which can further reduce the tendency to creep forward. When he guesses wrong or does nothing, approach to whatever distance you need to get the response. Praise these repaired trials, but try to reserve food reinforcement for snappy, correct responses on the initial cue or signal. Avoid the habit of holding the signal or repeating the cue, as this will lead to chronically sluggish changes. Randomize the order of positions so the dog can't latch onto a pattern, such as sit down, stand, sit down, stand. Do not try this exercise without the physical barrier until he is truly acing the changes without hesitation. If you allow creeping in early training, it gets stamped into the exercise and will give you grief for all your distance work further down the road. Keeping creeping at bay is hard enough without good early training. Trainers are so eager to see what looks like a finished product that they not only try distance changes without their mechanical management too early. Do not do this. In fact, I quite like teaching the dog to back up and then employing this between position changes. This can be captured by a good shaper, or prompted by crowding the dog slightly by walking into him. After you cue and then prompt, as soon as he takes one step backwards, click and treat. Build distance and fade the crowding prompt, and then stick backups consistently between position changes once you start teaching distance. His anticipation of the next backup cue puts Pavlovian anticipation to work for you. Stays. Cueing in early training. An early stay exercise is actually pretty safe to use a hand signal, an open palm toward the dog like a traffic cop, and or the word stay right off the bat, because you are extremely likely to get good responses very early in the game. The cue also helps with the discrimination between targeting, stand, versus not targeting, stay. When you teach stay, you are also teaching the dog an exception to the targeting rule. The dog is now told he is wrong when he targets the treat. The word stay will provide a nice discriminative stimulus that will take on the meaning don't follow the treat. Until now, in his training, it has paid off to do what is very natural, targeting the treat or the hand. For example, follow it wherever it goes. Now you are asking for a strategy shift. This is not just a different behavior, but a new approach to finding out what the behavior is. Targeting was his strategy before. Now, not targeting the treat is the way to win it. The sequence is, therefore, 1. Cue or signal to sit or down. 2. Dog sits or lies down. 3. Praise/reinforce. 4. Cue to stay, verbal followed by signal. 5. Dog stays or breaks. 6. Reinforces stay or mark a mistake. 7. Release stay or do another few seconds if dog right. If dog wrong, repeat, exercise, or drop criteria. Be sure to say stay only once, then follow with your palm toward the dog. Novice trainers tend to fall into a mantra-like chant of stay, stay, stay to remind the dog. This is sloppy training. Give cues once and then sink into your main role of feedback provider. Kindergarten stay. For either sit or down stay, the first exercise is a repetition of the procedure described in the previous chapter for conditioning the no reward mark. As soon as the dog is in the sit or down position, hold the treat a couple of feet away at dog height and snatch it away, just after your NRM, at the first sign of movement. Be sure to hold the treat at dog height rather than high and out of striking distance. The whole idea is to tempt him to move so that you can mark this as an error and get a more deliberate attempt to not move. This is playing devil's advocate and really grinds home the concept of stay. Repeating this forces the dog to switch strategies to plan B, which is usually immobility. The first evidence of deliberate freezing must be immediately reinforced. The duration of the stay in this exercise is a second or so for the first few trials. The time it takes for you to notice that the dog decided not to move for a second. If he doesn't move, pay. Again, if you're struggling with the physical mechanics of orchestrating this with nice, fast delivery, necessary because of the strings of losers, watch slick trainers do it to give you a picture of what it looks like. Once the dog reliably freezes in spite of the devil's advocate dangling treat, practice with your body stationed on the other side of the dog, and in front of the dog, but with the treat lower and on the floor. Be ready to cover it in case he breaks. Breaking mustn't work. Then start bumping the duration to 2, 3, 5, and then 10 seconds by simply marking and removing the treat every time the dog breaks position. He learns that he can sit there and keep collecting at 5 to 10 second intervals provided he doesn't move. The down stay can be harder than the sit stay for dogs that pop back into a sit. The dog may assume the exercise is a push-up or three-way. This is another case of inner cue discrimination. You want a down stay, whereas the dog learned the pattern of alternating sit, down, stand. Another position change follows down, might be his policy. This again underscores how readily dogs learn patterns. He only knows 3 cues, and already it's a pattern. This tendency in dogs works against you every step of the way. An exception to this tendency working against the trainer is performance of a fixed behavior chain with no marks off for slop, link merging, and speed as a criteria. The dog wants to learn the right order, but you want him to learn the right cues. The way out is through perseverance and exquisite timing. Mark the instant the dog starts to pop out of his down and re-signal the down. Drop your verbal cue. Criterion as you are after the duration component of the down here. Click all evidence of the dog holding the down stay while you rise to standing position and or move. As you did for sit stay, work up to 5 to 10 seconds on the down with the handler standing in a normal posture. Releases. In any stay exercise, when the dog has stayed for far enough, and amid enough distraction, he has made the criteria for reinforcement. In other words, you may choose to release him from the stay, rather than reinforcing him while he's in the stay and then continuing the same stay. It's actually a new trial once reinforcement has been dispensed. A release is distinct from the reinforcing of the stay. The reinforcer is the treat. The release is a signal that the dog may now move again. Whether you reinforce a given stay or not, you must let the dog know when it's over. You can stop staying now. You may also wish to reinforce a stay in progress but not release it just yet. Most clicker trainers click to signal reinforcement and the trial, and also the obligation to continue the behavior, which is moot for behaviors where the dog can't collect reinforcers and continue the behavior at the same time anyway. In the case of stays and other behaviors where duration building is so critical, watching and healing are 2 others, I favor installing a formal release word. It's handy to be able to reinforce along the way and have the dog collect reinforcement in the position. Most dog trainers use the word okay, said with some enthusiasm, but some argue that this word comes out too often in everyday use. Practice this basic stay exercise in as many places as possible to get in some early generalization. Vary your position relative to the dog, vary the food reinforcer, vary trainers if you can, and even try dropping the food on the ground by accident. When you play this last game of chicken, it is critically important that you are fast enough to prevent the dog from getting the treat when he breaks the stay. Dogs usually fall apart when you drop the treat. Not targeting food in your hand is one thing, but not targeting an obvious freebie on the floor is much, much harder. So be ready. As soon as you drop the food and the dog breaks, mark the mistake, and snatch up or step on the bait. Recue the sit or down and repeat the same exercise until the dog freezes even when you drop the food on the floor. Reinforce this show of self-control immediately. The dog learns that the way to win even that piece of bait on the floor, once the word stay has been uttered, is to not move. When the dog is doing this correctly, over and over, try it in a new location or with a different body posture or type of bait to get more generalization. You can also practice this exercise with meals and exits to the yard. Ask the dog to sit stay before you put the bowl on the floor or open the door. The dog must hold position while you put the bowl down or open the door and wait until you give the release to begin eating or to exit. Elementary school stays. The goal is that the dog will hold a sit or down stay for up to 20 or 30 seconds while the handler walks in circles around the dog. The dog must remain seated or down even if the trainer is moving. To start training this, cue sit or down, then cue the stay as in the kindergarten exercise, and take a small step to one side. Keep your eye on the dog. Try to time your no reward mark to the instant his butt starts to come off the floor. Also mark any lifting of front paws to rotate with you. If he holds position, pivot back in front of him and reinforce. Then try 2 steps to the side. If he breaks the stay, mark the mistake, get him back into a sit, and then try 1 step again before attempting 2. Remember that beginner dogs are fragile little learners. They need to win the game often. With a dog who is more experienced at learning, the trainer would probably take another stab at 2 steps after the dog's boo-boo rather than giving him an almost guaranteed success on the very next trial. More experienced dogs tolerate dry spells between reinforced responses better than greenhorns. When your dog is hooked on obedience, you can get away with more push in your training. From now, err on the side of being too generous and gradual. This is especially the case if your dog's attention tends to wander. Work gradually up to the level where you can cue sit stay or down stay, and on the first trial, every time, walk around the dog without him breaking the stay. He is allowed to follow you by rotating his head, but body rotations or position breaks are no good. Many dogs find it disconcerting to have you move behind them while they hold a stay, so always be prepared to temporarily drop standards and reinforce easier repetitions if things bog down. For instance, if you have worked up to 5 or 6 steps to almost behind the dog, but the dog breaks the stay whenever you take that 7th step to directly behind him, go back to the reinforceable 5 or 6 step exercise often enough to keep the dog playing the game. You may also insert an intermediate step like 6 steps plus a lean toward the 7th. If you can do that, reinforce it a few times and then try a half step after number 6, and so on. Dogs fall apart because trainers lack the discipline to train gradually enough. You set arbitrary criteria, in other words. It is extremely presumptuous, if you think about it, to want to dictate what another being, let alone a being from another species, is going to find easy or difficult. You must always select something from the sample of responses the dog is already giving you. When he can hold his stay while you parade around him, take it on the road. Expect the dog to regress in each new situation. Many people take it very personally when the dogs regress or fail to generalize. They start searching for a reason. Overexcitement, lack of exercise, malice, revenge, spite, stubbornness, breed. These are usually irrelevant. The reason is likely to be a competing motivator or a failure to generalize. If you've got him, for example, you don't have competition, simply retrain if necessary from scratch. The retraining will go more quickly than the initial installation, often with 1 trial per increase in difficulty. Dog, oh yeah, this again. For now, avoid locations with strong competing motivation. For example, running squirrels. You can try those later. High school stays. The goal is that the dog will hold a stay for a minute or 2 with the handler 30 or so feet away. There are 2 parameters here, one of duration, the minute or 2, and one of distance, the 30 feet. These must be perfected separately before combining them. So first, while remaining at very close distance, start increasing the length of the stay. You can walk circles around him as in the previous exercise, or simply hang out in front. I like to mix it up. From 30 seconds to go to 45, then 60, and so on. If at any duration the dog falls apart, reattempt it once, and if he breaks again, back off to the last success and then inch up more gradually. For instance, if he breaks when you go from 75 to 90 seconds, repeat 75 and then try 80. It may take a few sessions to get him up to 2 minutes or more in any location. When he is reliably doing a couple of minutes without breaking, tackle distance. For this, you must work in a safe, secure area. To train distance while keeping duration short, practice bungee stays. Pretend there's an elastic cord between you and your dog. Move away from him to an initial distance of, say, 6 feet. When you reach the 6-foot mark, immediately bounce back in to reinforce the stay. If the dog breaks at any point, mark the error and try again. If the dog breaks again, do an easier one, for example, shorter distance. As for duration building, I suggest attempting the same distance one more time before lowering your standards. If you lose the dog, for example, he loses interest and stops even trying, you need to drop your standards faster. In this case, after one mistake. Remember, whenever you're cranking up the level of difficulty, be very sensitive to the animal's attitude to the training. His quitting or excessive frustration means you're going too fast. The reason you can't initially combine the parameters of distance and duration is that both you and the dog need to agree on the criteria for reinforcement at any given moment in training. If you attempt 20 feet for 1 full minute right off the bat and the dog actually stays for 40 seconds and then breaks, he missed the duration aspect but nailed the distance. Do you reinforce or not? Criteria pileups like this can be very confusing and demoralizing for dogs. Choose one and train it, only combining it with the others when they too have been trained separately. Not only do reinforcers then hit target, but no reward marks will also be more likely to hit accurately. When you do start combining distance and duration, start modestly with something like 10 feet for 10 seconds, then 20 feet for 10 seconds, and then 10 feet for 20 seconds. Crank the standard up gradually by raising one element and then, if successful, the other. Don't raise two things at the same time. In fact, drop one when you raise the other. Disciplined parameter juggling is the hallmark of a good trainer. When the dog does 2 minutes at 30 feet, take it on the road. Drop back to modest distance for modest durations, say 10 feet for 10 seconds, and build back again. Each location will, once again, probably cause a regression, which you will take in stride by dropping standards to get reinforceable responses and then gradually building again. This pattern should be starting to feel familiar now. Once you've got it in 4 or 5 varied locations, you graduate to college where you get into heavier distraction proofing. College stays. The goal now is for the dog to hold a stay in presence of distractions such as other dogs milling around, a squirrel or tennis ball zipping past, or a wiggly child patting the dog's head. Each distraction needs to be worked separately and with distance and duration minimized at first. Go back to working up close to the dog doing 3 to 5 second distraction-laden trials, reinforcing after each and every distraction refusal. It's important to understand what a distraction refusal is, because this is the reinforceable response in distraction proofing. A lot of people beaver away at manufacturing distraction refusals with gradual increases in intensity and beautifully timed no reward marks, but then fail to reinforce them when they get them. Have the picture clear in your mind before you start presenting distractions and reinforce without hesitation when he doesn't break. What makes it difficult in stays is that the reinforceable response is a non-event. The dog does nothing but hold his stay. This is a classic example of why you must think in advance about criteria. Begin with some simple handler movement distractions. Jump in the air a few feet from the dog. If he holds his stay, go back and reinforce. If he breaks, mark it and repeat. If he breaks again, assess. Was it a major break or was it an almost stay? If the former, back off and do something easier. If the latter, try one more time. Needless to say, at every moment during distraction training, you will have your full concentration on the dog. It is critical that you catch the instant when your dog begins to break his stay. There's a saying, a mediocre trainer catches the dog after he gets up on a stay exercise. A good trainer catches the dog as he starts to get up. A great trainer catches the first muscle contraction. In distraction training, timing is even more critical because your best hope of stopping the dog is from going flat out for a really attractive distraction is to interrupt only in this sequence. An extreme case will help clarify the point. Imagine attempting a no reward mark on a dog chasing a fleeing squirrel at the moment before his jaws make contact with the squirrel some 50 yards away from you. Now imagine a no reward mark when he's at your side and his ears go up when he sees a squirrel in the far distance. Your chances are better in the second case.
Whenever the dog gets 2 or 3 right in a row, escalate the distraction. Try a jumping jack. Try a twirl. Try flamenco dancing. Try the twist. Try crouching down. This last one is tricky because for a lot of dogs, crouching is a recall prompt. It is not, however, a cue, so it's fair game for proofing stay. The dog will start to learn that the only thing that can end a stay is another cue or a release. Try faking his knees. Try drumming on the floor. Whenever he refuses a distraction by holding the stay, go back and reinforce. If he cracks, mark the mistake and repeat. Never escalate until you've had at least 2 perfect responses in a row with the same distraction. Try lying on the floor. Try rolling on the floor. Try bouncing a ball. Try rolling a ball. Try throwing a ball. Try throwing several at once. Now try touching the dog while he is staying. For a great many dogs, this is a whole new ballgame. If your dog is jittery or explosively friendly when people approach or touch him, this sit to greet will prove tricky, but it is so worth cultivating. Start doing a series of approaches and head touches yourself until the dog is sitting solidly, trial after trial. Then try swishing him all the way from head to tail. Then do simulations of how people pat dogs. This will include the up and down pats on the head as might be delivered by a young child and the 2-handed grasp around the ears with deep scritching that many adult dog lovers administer. When you can't get him to break the stay anymore, try getting the other people to administer the pats while you watch and supply feedback in the way of reinforcers and NRMs. Instruct your helpers clearly to start with light head touches. It is critical that you do multiple repetitions, for example, a series of touches rather than just 1 or 2. Please note, if your dog is not socialized to people, do not do this until he has had some remedial socialization described in Chapter 3. When the dog is solidly sitting for head touches, try the full-length swish by the same person. When this has been solid for several trials in a row, start the gamut of dog pat styles. You can have multiple people do the same level of exercise until the dog can't be stumped, or you can stick with the same person and escalate difficulty. Then start with another, whichever is more convenient. Be prepared for the dog to fall apart temporarily each time you introduce a new person. The magic moment is when you introduce a new person and whiz through the progression without any mistakes at all. This may be on person number 3 or person number 12, but it will eventually happen. Make sure you've covered the major demographics, especially kids. When this is done, you have a nicely proofed sit to be patted. When he will hold position confidently as you throw balls and squeaky toys all over the place, and as he's manhandled by any person, take your distraction training on the road. Each new location will compound the distraction problem with its unique combination of ambient distractions. This is above and beyond the fact that all new locations evoke a failure to generalize. It will therefore be necessary, as usual, to drop the standards and rebuild the sit-stay for each location. Take comfort in the fact that each subsequent retraining of obedience exercises will go faster and faster, culminating one day in a dog that you can teach even brand new exercises in highly distracting environments, and who will almost instantly generalize that training to all novel locations. Such an educated dog is simply a product of extensive training, rather than some genetic endowment of either dog or trainer. Luckily, training is fun. Get involved with the process rather than obsessing about the product. You'll get there if you persevere. Come when called. Coming when called is high on the priority list for any pet dog to learn, yet is usually mangled by the trainer if it is taught at all. The critical mistake in many cases is the attempt to use the cue before it has been installed. This premature use of the cue actually serves to undermine future attempts at training. The typical premature use scenario consists of the owner calling the dog over and then doing nothing in particular if the dog comes, or else inadvertently initiating something unpleasant or ending a pleasant activity. The cue is presumed known because the owner has witnessed correct responses in the past. Sooner or later, the behavior falls apart utterly and completely, and the owner blames the dog for a moral failing. Underneath all this is the dangerous assumption that the dog will be naturally obedient. Let's look in detail at what's happening. Most puppies have a natural tendency to approach you when you call them. Crouch, clap your hands, or make enticing noises. They are compulsive greeters. They are also, as you know, perfectly obedient to the laws of learning. If you capitalize on this natural inclination for the puppy to rush at you for these prompts, and then fail to reinforce these beautiful responses, or worse, apply either a positive or negative punisher, the puppy's days of coming will be numbered. The subsequent disobedience has nothing to do with rebellion, testing of authority, or spite, but merely represents the cumulative effect of any and all deliberate and inadvertent training to date. What are the consequences to the dog of coming? Let's look at an example. A new puppy, Muffin, arrives home with her new family. For weeks, Muffin toddles enthusiastically up to anyone who calls her, wagging and wiggling. This is compulsive greeting. Muffin's owners presume that she understands to come when she is called. She is, after all, doing it every time. She is, however, endowed with a brainstem and spinal cord, which make her what? Subject to the laws of learning. After a few weeks, Muffin occasionally does not immediately rush to anyone who calls, especially if she is otherwise occupied. But this is not considered a big deal because she comes most of the time. Her owners routinely call her over to give her affection, to come in from the yard outside when she has been let out to have a pee, to interrupt her when she is getting into something she shouldn't be doing, to groom her, to put her into her crate when they leave, and occasionally to reprimand her for leaving a puddle on the floor or for chewing the baseboards. What is the cumulative effect of all of this? Sometimes Muffin gets reinforced for coming by the attention and affection. The rest of the time, when she comes on the cues, Muffin, or come, the result is either the initiation of an adversive punishment for past transgressions, grooming she's not a fan of and hasn't been counter-conditioned, or the ending of something she likes, being in the yard, getting into stuff she shouldn't be getting into, being crated. When she is old enough, Muffin is taken to the park for exercise and called when it is time to go back home. The sequence used is 1. Cue, come. 2. Muffin comes. 3. Leash put on, freedom ended. She comes the first couple of times, but then starts refusing to come. One day, when her owner is late for work, Muffin does not come at the end of her morning romp and plays keep away for 15 minutes. The owner calls an obedience school that evening and announces that Muffin is stubborn. After all, she knows what come means and yet refuses to comply. But what does come really mean to Muffin? Muffin has learned first and foremost that come, clapping and bribes very often mean the end of fun or the start of something yucky. She learns, as any normal animal would, to not approach when she hears that word or sees that picture. This is not related to some rebellious flaw in her particular personality. This is important to understand. The fatal flaw in the thinking of most owners is that they imagine that the dog is a moral being who understands the owner's authority and is susceptible to guilt. When the owner demonstrates disapproval of the dog for not coming, this is presumed to be sufficient motivation to overcome the obvious animal learning implications. The initiation of aversives or ending of reinforcers for the dog contingent on coming when called. Dogs are amoral. If they have a concept of the word should, it would tie closely into their pure sense of self-interest and perfect obedience to learning laws. In dog culture, when someone calls you, you should absolutely not come if that results in the ending of something you like or initiation of something you don't like. The first mistake Muffin's owners made, long before punishing scores of recalls, was to presume that the dog was obeying a prompt, the calling and clapping. Prompts are merely elicitors. They tend to make behavior happen, all other things being equal. But these antecedents quickly take on the more powerful role of discriminative stimuli when they prove to predict contingencies of relevance to the animal. The consequences make all the difference. The prompt in the case of Muffin wore out pretty quickly when come started to mean bad news. This is why a prompt might appear to work for a while and then cease to work anymore. The way out of this common predicament is to bite the bullet from the outset and not only accept, but actively exploit those laws of learning to which the dog will be perfectly obedient. Train in harmony with the principles of how animals learn. Stop trying to fight it. Stop trying to invent some mythical system, however appealing to human brains, that kind of sort of exploits learning laws. Learn the actual laws. Each and every time the dog approaches, systematically reinforce him with affection, play, and food treats from your pocket. Reserve the dog's name and the word come as sacred utterances. Never follow them with something the dog will not like or with the cessation of something the dog is enjoying. Have regular recall conditioning sessions as you did for sit, down, and stand. When in the park or dog run, Teach the dog that come is simply a check-in most of the time. The dog comes, gets a pat and food treat, and then is told to go back and play. Teach the dog that failure to comply in the heat of fun results in the ending of that fun. Stack the deck in your own favor. Here are some exercises. Kindergarten recall exercise. 2 or more family members take turns calling the puppy, or untrained adult dog, back and forth in the kitchen or down a long hallway. Every time the puppy comes to someone, he is told to sit, taken by the collar, and then given a food treat from the collar's pocket, or given a fast round of a tug game with a toy from the collar's pocket. A variation on this exercise is hide and seek. The dog is held by one person while the other hides somewhere in the house. The dog is released right after the hidden person yells, "Muffin, come." The dog is now on a search and rescue mission. When the dog arrives, a greeting celebration ensues and a tug game is initiated. During this time, the other family member hides. The dog is then sent, after that person's cue, to make another find. The dog's impression of the word come shoots way up. You can also practice random recalls, for which you only need one person. Call the dog over at random times and reinforce him with a surprise treat or play session. In fact, why not precede all enjoyable activities with a recall so that the best predictor the dog has that something good is about to happen is the word come. When practicing recalls, the initial sequence of events should be 1. Cue to come, 2. Prompts, hand clapping, luring, squealing noises, etc. 3. Dog approaches, 4. Dog prays enthusiastically during approach, 5. Dog told to sit when he arrives, 6. Dog sits, 7. Handler takes dog's collar in one hand, and 8. Reaches into pocket with the other hand to give dog a food treat or tug toy. When the dog has had several brief sessions like this and thoroughly enjoys the game, phase out the prompting, event 2, and then the getting warmer feedback, event 4, so that the dog performs the behavior for the cue only. Try to practice in at least 3 or 4 different quiet locations before starting the proofing exercise that follows. Elementary school recall exercise. If you recall cue were a wall that you were building, you would have, with this kindergarten exercise, laid down the first row of bricks. You've started a foundation. To lay down the second row of bricks, you would teach the dog a controlled distraction exercise. For this, you need 2 people. One is the handler, and the other is in the role of distractor. The handler has nothing on her. No treats, no toys, nothing. The distractor has control of a top reinforcer, liver, cheese, or the dog's favorite tug toy. The distractor shows the dog that he has possession, but without letting the dog have actual access. The handler, who has shown the dog that she has no reinforcers with her, goes a short distance away and calls the dog. In most cases, the dog will initially ignore the handler and play the distractor, the obvious slot machine at the moment. The distractor will simply ignore the dog's efforts. These might include pawing, jumping, whining, performing beautiful sequences of sit, down, stand, barking, etc. The handler will keep trying to prompt a recall at regular intervals. Think of it as suggesting a strategy to the dog. There is no rush here because the motivator is well controlled. The dog is not winning anything but simply wasting his time with all of his behavior directed at the distractor. He just does not know this yet. Sooner or later, the dog's strategies to access the distractor's goodies will start to extinguish, and he will experiment by moving towards the handler. Praise this with wild enthusiasm. If the dog abandons this strategy before arriving and goes back to playing the distractor, simply stop praising and go back to waiting. If the dog arrives at the handler's position, the distractor immediately runs over and relinquishes one big treat or gives the toy to the handler for a nice round of tug. Then the distractor back to his original position with the reinforcer, more than likely followed by the dog, and the exercise is repeated. The dog learns over time that the way to get what the distractor has is to do what the handler is saying. Obedience is the answer. Be advised, this takes time and patience the first few trials. Once the dog can't be stumped and flies over to the handler, often before the recall cue is given, this is fine. Switch to another reinforcer. If you were using cheese, try roast chicken. If the dog is a high drive type, use a hot toy. Once the dog is fluent at this, switch again. Keep rotating the motivator until the dog can't be stumped on the first trial for a novel motivator. Then take it on the road. Repetition is the key with this exercise. Some dogs catch on more readily than others. I'd bet this has less to do with learning rate than it does with how impulsive or emotional a dog is, as well as how well the dog has been primed with the basic kindergarten recall exercise. It is a good idea to alternate roles of handler and distractor so the dog learns that the cue come is the key thing to attend to, not a specific person. Always rule out what's irrelevant. To consolidate the concept and get some nice cold trials in, I suggest doing this exercise in the day-to-day life whenever you have a controllable motivator. For instance, if the dog is all excited at the front door at walk time, move 10 feet back from the door and call him. He will have to move away from the door in order to get you to approach and open it. You can make him do a recall in the opposite direction of anything he strains toward while on the walk in order to be granted access to sniff it. You can't make him do short recalls away from dogs in order to meet them. You can make him do a short recall away from someone moving a favorite toy around in a tantalizing way in order to have it given or thrown. The more you vary the particular motivator and context the exercise is done in, the better generalized the dog's concept will be. If you want something, believe it or not, the best way to get it is to go to your handler when called, not try to directly access it. This is such a fabulous money in the recall bank. High school level recall, the speed drill. When the dog is an ace at the controlled distraction recall exercise, it is time to bump the motivation up another notch. You will now teach the dog the game of running through your legs after a thrown ball or tug toy. This is putting the dog's predatory drive to work for you rather than having it as a perpetually competing motivator. If your dog is not very toy-driven, you can omit this exercise or else use something like a Kong stuffed with goat cheese that you let him have for a brief time after every correct response. At first, use no cues. Simply get the dog interested in the toy by playing a quick round of tug or teasing him with it. Then, with your legs apart, lure him in close, and when he's focused on the toy, roll it through so that the dog goes through as well. Repeat this over and over to get the dog used to going through your legs. Some dogs are deeply suspicious about doing this. Big dogs will have to flatten themselves somewhat. All dogs can learn to do it, and it is worth the effort. When the dog is going through your legs without hesitation, put him in a sit stay 8 or 10 feet away. Set yourself up, and on the cue come, send him through for the throw. Delay throwing the object until you are sure he is going to go through. Dogs quickly get into the habit of going around rather than through if the trainer allows a few of these scoot-arounds to be reinforced by premature throws. If the dog attempts to go around, hold the throw. He must learn that he has to go through in order to get the toy. Keep your throws as horizontal as possible, rather than throwing upwards, to maximize the flat-out chase aspect. After each throw, have a vigorous round of tug-of-war. This makes the game even more interesting to the dog as well as giving him a reason to get the toy back to you as soon as possible after he catches it. As he gets better at it, increase the recall distance. Do plenty from a sit-stay, but also do it out of context of formal training sessions. Spring come on him when he is least expecting it. Have your tug toy hidden on you. This can be the initiation of your daily tug/retrieve session with him, as well as part of the obedience breaks during tug. The more the dog does this exercise, the more he learns to charge you with great intensity on the word come. Harnessing predatory motivation exploits one of the most potent motivators around. For many dogs, it far outranks straight food reinforcement. When the dog will charge you at top speed from 30 feet away and reliably go through your legs every time, fade the prompts. Up to now, you've been standing with legs apart and tug toy in hand. This picture is an important signal for the dog. It predicts what follows. What the dog must now learn is that the word come by itself is as good a predictor as that picture. The way to do this is to first hide the tug toy up your shirt or in your pocket, somewhere the dog can't see it, but where you can quickly access it at the key moment. Put the dog on a sit-stay and leave him to set up a recall as usual. When you get your 30 feet or so out, stand normally, legs together and arms by your side. Tell the dog to come. What you probably find is that the dog does not charge you with anywhere near the same zeal he did when you were doing the previous exercise through your legs. That's okay. When he gets halfway to you, whip the toy out from its hiding place. Open your legs and do the recall throw as usual, just before he gets to you. In a few repetitions, the dog will start charging again. Even though you are standing normally, this is because your normal posture has started to predict the picture he has come to know and love. That of you, with legs apart and toy in hand. You will work now to gradually delay the leg opening and toy appearance until the last possible instant. The goal is for the dog to learn that your regular recall cue and posture predicts the game as reliably as the open leg posture did before. When the dog charges his recalls with you standing upright, it is time to put the sit back in. The goal now is for the dog to delay his decision on whether to sit or run through until the last possible instant. The way to accomplish this is to sometimes send him through and sometimes ask for a sit. You ask for a sit by keeping your legs together and cueing a sit. The first time you spring the sit on him after he has done scores of drills through your legs, be sure to unlock your knees or you could be injured. A good idea is to cue the sit well in advance on the first occasion, when the dog is, say, 10 or 15 feet away. Use a verbal cue as well as a broad hand signal. Practice a few sits in a row until he seems to anticipate the sit. Then send him through the legs a couple of times. Then go back to sit. The idea is to keep him guessing so that his policy becomes 2. Charge at top speed and then evaluate when 10 feet away. This way you retain maximum motivation with deceleration delayed until just before recall completion. That's good juggling of the speed and sit elements. To reinforce recalls where a sit is the final product, whip the toy out from under your shirt and play tug after he sits. Perfection of this exercise lends tremendous distraction proofing to your recall by placing it at the top of the reinforcer hierarchy in virtually any situation. After all, the reason that dogs would rather play with dogs or chase squirrels or sniff through the underbrush rather than coming when called is that these activities are fun and exciting, whereas coming is not. Your job is not to lament this, but to make use of the dog's addiction to fun by making recalls the most fun and exciting activity he gets to do. College recall. If you have successfully installed the high school speed drill exercise described above, you may find you don't need the college level exercise. In other words, the dog has a near-perfect recall in all situations. That is the power of predatory motivation. If you weren't instantly successful with that exercise, don't be tempted to give up early and try the next one in hopes that it will fix competing motivation problems. Try harder to cultivate a speed drill. Some dogs don't take longer to catch on than others. These are the unkeen retriever types, typically. It's worth loosening them up in any event, so I would encourage you to persevere. The college-level exercise is designed to convince the dog that you control access to competing motivators in the environment. It is a variation of the recall you did in elementary school. Typical competing motivation is the dog interacting with another dog, deeply embroiled in some small on the ground, or pursuing a fleeing object like a cat or squirrel or car. Please note that if you have a dog who is not conditioned, for example, you have not diligently done the kindergarten and elementary school recall exercises to the point of reliability in a variety of locations, you have no business trying what follows. It's not a band-aid to fix your stubborn dog who door dashes every chance he gets or won't come in from the yard. No skipping ahead. There are no quick fixes here. You must pay your dues first. Enlist a helper, someone who is good at agitating dogs with furry toys. Set this distractor up in an outdoor grassy location with an ordinary bucket and a novel furry toy on a 10-foot rope. You are going to happen upon the scene 50 yards away, after your helper is already in place to best simulate a natural squirrel flushing. Your dog will be off leash. The idea is for the helper to run along with the toy dragging behind, which, if your dog is a squirrel chaser, has a reasonable chance of eliciting chase. If the vegetation is too high, the furry toy won't be visible when your assistant drags it along the ground, so choose the location with this in mind. Once he's spotted the furry toy and given chase, try your recall. Cue. There's a small chance he'll do it, but a better chance he won't. That's fine. Once the dog ignores the cue, your helper will quickly double back, put the bucket over the furry, open and down, and hold it down, waiting. The dog will arrive at the bucketed furry looking very keen. Try your recall cue again. Sooner or later, the dog will do a recall. Once he does, have him sit and then say, "Get it." Once you do, point out to him that the furry toy is on the move again. Your helper will have unleashed it once your dog completes his recall. This time, let him catch it. It's worth trying again, even though the element of surprise and the promise of a real furry is gone. It's really worth setting this up on a few more occasions. The goal for the dog to learn that turning on a dime and completing the recall is the only way to get the furry. Then there's some chance it might kick in a real situation. Mastering this exercise doesn't produce a squirrel-proof recall on every dog, but it does sometimes. And failing to master the exercise is extremely unlikely to yield a squirrel-proof recall. If he has mastered the exercise as described, and you want to live dangerously, try varying the point in the chase at which you give the recall cue. Bearing in mind that the further the dog is from you and the closer he is to the object, the harder it gets and the more you squeeze your helper. Achieving a dog that turns on a dime at any point in the chase is graduating college with high honors. Pulling on leash. Dogs naturally pull on leash. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is that most dogs naturally ambulate faster than most people, and the pulling reflects this discrepancy. The other reason is that the pulling so elicited is then reinforced by the owner in the form of forward movement. The dog continues to pull because pulling works. The other reason that has been put forward for pulling in dogs, even to the point of gasping for breath, is obvious discomfort. Is what's called an opposition reflex. As soon as they feel pressure against their necks or chest, they reflexively lean into it. An opposition reflex beefed up by selective breeding results in dogs like huskies and malamutes who really love pulling in harness. It is intrinsically reinforcing quite apart from getting where they're going. So given what you're up against, it is prudent to begin anti-pull training from day one, rather than waiting till the dog has an entrenched pulling addiction. The main pull prevention exercise for puppies or dogs who do not already have a strong habit is the red light, green light game. The rule of this game is that while on a walk with the dog, you may only move forward if the leash is loose and jangly. As soon as the dog tightens the leash, you freeze dead in your tracks. The loose leash is the green light. Handler moves forward. The tight leash is the red light. Handler stops. Moving in the direction the dog wants to go is a potent reinforcer, which you must never give for pulling on leash. The first time you play this game, the dog will likely do a bit of lunging and straining when you put the brakes on. Simply wait until eventually, by chance, he slackens the leash. Then start moving. As soon as you do so, he will re-energize and no doubt hit the end of the leash, causing you to stop again. And so on. The dog requires some repetition to see the trend. Tightening the leash grinds the walk to a halt every single time. Slackening the leash makes movement happen. The dog does not learn to walk on a loose leash in one shot. What you get, rather, is a gradual decrease in attempts at pulling. So keep it up. Timing helps enormously here. The more you can simulate a cause and effect relationship between behavior and consequence, the faster he'll learn. Clickers and NRMs can help here, though many people teach anti-pull without them. If you already have an entrenched pulling problem, you will probably have to use heavier artillery than the red light, green light game. Your options are to 1. Try the red light, green light game anyway, 2. Play the game but with bigger penalties, or 3. Change equipment. Playing the game with bigger penalties means that, rather than simply stopping when the dog starts pulling, you retreat some distance to make the dog cover the same piece of ground again. It's like a 3-yard penalty. A good motto is, we'll keep doing this patch of sidewalk until you do it without pulling. The first few times out, the dog will likely have to do the same piece of ground many times in a row before he figures out that it's his pulling, which is giving him the penalty. Once again, to sharpen up timing, mark the initiation of pulling with "too bad." This signals that he has just made things worse for himself in terms of his apparent goal of moving in direction X. When you retreat to retry a piece of ground, make sure the leash is slack before commencing another stab at forward walking. Industrial strength pullers can actually injure their human companions. If pulling has been allowed to blossom to this point, these dogs usually need new equipment. There are several power steering options available. Probably the most effective of these is the dog halter, which looks and works very much like a hackamore does on a horse. Halters move the leverage point from the neck to the muzzle. Now when the dog tries to pull, there is much less to lean into. The dog's head simply turns around. These sort of devices allow people to control half-ton horses, so it's not surprising that they can give you a lot of control of an 80-pound Labrador. Halters for dogs are put out under a few different names, like Duntleader, New Tricks Easy Way Collar, Snoot Loop, and Halty. The advantages of halters are, 1. They greatly reduce pulling on leash in most dogs. 2. They work without employing pain. 3. They require very little expertise. The disadvantages of halters are, 1. Many dogs fight them initially. There is an adjustment period or else the dog must be gradually desensitized. 2. To the untrained eye, they resemble muzzles, which hurt owner compliance. 3. The effects do not generalize well to when the dog is not wearing the device. Aside from the excellent reduction in pulling achieved, halters are good tools for controlling lunging, aggressive dogs by virtue of the fact that the head can be turned away from the hot stimulus. They have not caught on as much as they should, in spite of their obvious efficacy. Because of those first 2 disadvantages, people don't like the look and don't like seeing their dog, so obviously hating it for the first few times it's put on. People who use them are asked over and over by passerby why their dog is wearing a muzzle. Halters are far from muzzles. While good control of the head and jaws is achieved, dogs can pant, drink, retrieve a ball, and bite while wearing one. I personally think the look is cute. Dogs wearing halters look like little ponies. The adjustment period is over quickly if the owner handles the first few experiences properly. This means not giving in and removing the halter if the dog throws a tantrum. Gently raise the dog's head every time the dog lowers it and pause at the halter. Release the head and provide lots of praise and treats whenever the dog stops fighting it. Another option is an anti-pull harness. This is not to be confused with pulling harnesses, which are used for sled racing and draft work. The original anti-pull harness is the Sporn harness, named after its patenter. Another brand that has hit the market is the Sensation harness. These products can be a veritable overnight miracle for some pullers, though. For others, it makes a smaller dent in their pulling. Correct fit is essential and may be behind lackluster results. Prospective users may want to test drive one on their own dog before buying. The advantages of anti-pull harnesses are 1. Very good dog and owner acceptance. 2. Good efficacy. Pulling is significantly curtailed in most dogs. 3. They take little skill to operate. The disadvantages are 1. They don't work on every dog. 2. The effect is not generalized when the dog is not wearing the device. 3. They require some skill to fit correctly. These two products, halters and anti-pull harnesses, represent the evolution of anti-pull training. However, many people still address their pulling on leash difficulties with another device, the choke collar. As its name suggests, this collar is designed to strangle the dog. It is probably the most widespread tool in dog training. There are chain link strangle collars, ones with wider links to preserve the dog's coat, not his trachea, mind you, his coat. Fabric ones with limited strangulation capacity, and ones with enhanced strangulation capacity. They clip on and sit higher on the dog's neck to increase the ability of the collar to cut off the dog's ear. It is pretty amazing how much time and energy has been devoted to the design of strangulation devices for man's best friend. People avoid halters in droves because the dog doesn't like it, but think nothing of digging metal or a thin cord right into their dog's windpipe. It's a tool that, used as directed, can cause acute or cumulative injury. One problem with strangle collars is that the aversive delivered is mild to moderate for most dogs. It doesn't hurt that much, and so the dog habituates and pulling comes back, necessitating a more ferocious jerk or an upgrade to a prong collar. And when it does kind of sort of work, rarely does the dog get 1 or 2 shots. A virtual lifetime of leash jerks is in store for dogs whose owners opt to use chokers to train. But while a strangle collar's capacity to hurt is iffy, their capacity to harm, for example, to damage the dog, is considerable. This is what is so insidious. It seems to have a very little effect, so owners escalate the number and force of leash jerks or switch to a more dangerous model when that dog habituates to the jerks. All the while, the dog's windpipe is being bent. Another problem with the choke collar is the strength and coordination required to deliver an adequate leash correction. Many people are physically or psychologically unable to do the technique correctly. They end up simply putting on a choker and hoping it will do the work itself. The result is a dog straining on the end of a leash with his tongue turning a more obvious shade of blue. So why are they popular? The answer lies partly in the historical tradition of dog training. The original trainers were military men training German-bred German Shepherd dogs. This combo did okay with strangle collars, though, I would argue. Not as well as they would have done with clickers and sliced hot dogs, but they got away with it. These trainers' methods trickled down to people who, after World War II, offered the first organized community obedience classes for family pets. It kind of sort of worked on enough dogs that without critical scrutiny and without alternatives, the method stuck for decades. The other part of the answer is probably our punishment-oriented mentality. These collars give the handler power to deliver punishments with all the attendant frustration, displacement, and temporary suppression of behavior, and eventual global suppression of behavior. The last option for reducing pulling on leash is the prong or pinch collar. This looks like a medieval torture device, with double rows of blunt teeth which, when the dog pulls, dig into the dog's neck. This design makes it much more aversive than a strangle collar. Ironically, in spite of its fearsome appearance, it is self-limiting by design and therefore a much safer piece of equipment than a choker. Because of the increased aversiveness and decreased risk of harm, it is an infinitely better choice than a choker. However, in light of the availability of halters and anti-pull harnesses and of good early training on plain buckle collars using red light, green light technique, Prong collar use is hard to justify. It is even harder to justify as a tool to teach sit, stay, or come, or anything else apart from walking on leash. Heeling. Heeling is defined as the dog walking at your left side or right side, it doesn't matter unless you plan to compete in obedience trials, with his head or shoulder at your pant seam, never deviating from this position and sitting automatically whenever you stop. Teaching heeling and walking on a loose leash are two separate endeavors. Heeling is a complex behavior that will take many practice sessions before it is precise and reliable. Getting this behavior generalized from your living room to the great outdoors takes even more time and patience. And, because heeling is intense for the dog, don't expect it in endless quantities. Your main gear on walks will be loose leash walking, not heeling. This way, he has some freedom of movement to sniff the ground, the main highlight of walks for most dogs. Dogs need to investigate the urine and droppings of other dogs to gather important social data. They can't do this if they're heeling. The most important thing to remember is that walking on a loose leash and heeling are two separate enterprises. The heeling you will bring up to speed in training sessions before introducing it during walks, whereas walking on a loose leash will be trained on walks from day one. Kindergarten heeling. Kindergarten level heeling is simply teaching the dog to continuously follow a moving food target. The target is held against the left side of your body, so the dog also learns to follow your body while he follows your hand. First, fill your pockets with treats. Load one hand, the one on the opposite side the dog will be on, with treats. This hand should also be your clicker hand. Don't load more treats into it than you can carry and also smoothly click your clicker. You can teach heeling without using your clicker, but later on, when you've got a longer durations between reinforcement, it will be useful to precisely select your moment of reinforcement. Put one or two treats from your supply/clicker hand into your dog's side hand. Show this to the dog and then move the target to the side of your body around your pant seam at your dog's height. Large dog targets are at hip level or higher, and smaller dogs will need a target around knee level. This means that for initial training, you will have to bend if you have a little dog. Some people are more comfortable using their hand nearest the dog for storage and reaching across their body with the other hand to lure. Experiment to discover which variation feels more natural to you. If the dog attends to the target, for example, snuffles at the treat, start moving forward. Encourage him to stay nice and tight with verbal chatter. Take a few steps and let him have the treat. The mechanics of this take a bit of practice, so if you feel clumsy, don't worry. Keep practicing and you'll get better. Every now and then, stop walking. Right after you stop, give your hand signal for sit in a backwards direction, as though pushing the ear directly backwards. Click and reinforce the dog when he sits. The point is to get the dog to sit straight, for example, on a parallel track to yours and not turned inwards. Dogs will tend to turn in towards your body because this orientation has, up until now, been the one associated with reinforcement. Your goal in initial heel training is to get the dog to associate the reinforcers he will be earning, not just with the following, but with the view he has of you from heel position on a trajectory parallel to yours. Your bonus train this view by simply standing there with the dog sitting in heel position and moving a target from his nose all the way up the side of your body. If he is really keen to pivot to face you, do the exercise with him between you and a wall or other barrier, which will prompt him to sit straight. After praising him for watching for a couple of seconds, reinforce. You can even drop it to him. Some dogs enjoy learning to catch. When you do this, picture associating. Make sure you keep your shoulders straight and not turned toward the dog at any point. Shoulder rotating changes the view to exactly the one you don't want. After getting the hang of walking in straight lines, dispensing treats every 3 or 4 steps, and reloading from your other hand while walking, practice turning in all directions, right, left, and 180 degrees. When you turn 180 degrees, do so with the dog on the outside track. This means that if the dog is on your left, whirl around to your right. If your eventual aim is to compete in obedience, keep your left and right turns as square and military as possible, and single track on your about turns. This means that when you do the 180, you are walking on the same line in both directions before and after the turn, rather than executing a U-turn, which would put you in another lane. You will also have to learn smooth pace changes and decent footwork if you want to do well and look nice in the competitive obedience ring. So be sure to get yourself into the hands of a good, qualified instructor who can polish these things and teach you all the rules. For now, focus on improving your walk and reinforcement mechanics, and on getting the dog following reliably and turning as tightly in position as possible. Practice heeling in a few different low distraction environments before proceeding to elementary school. Elementary school heeling. The aim now is for the dog to heel with a fated target. Sit automatically when the handler stops and keep attention fixed on the handler at all times. Before trying these exercises, make sure you've practiced plenty of lure following as described in the kindergarten heeling exercise. The dog needs to be a rabid targeter, because this will ensure sufficient momentum for the fading and occasional removing of the target that you will be initiating now. In a low distraction environment, warm the dog up with a bit of lured heeling. Now do the following. For 1 second, move the target up and away, from your hip to your chest. When you do this, chat to the dog enthusiastically. You want to convey to him that moving the lure further away is a good thing. After 1 second, if he's with you, make it an actual good thing by reinforcing him with a treat. Then start off again with the lure in its original position. When he's following well, move it away again. Keep him with you using enthusiastic chatter for 1 second and then give the treat. The criterion you are isolating for reinforcement is his following the faded prompt, the more distant lure. Do the prompt fade over and over just before reinforcing. The goal is for the dog to learn that the fading of the food target means reinforcement is about to occur. If you fade the food target and the heeling falls apart immediately, it usually means you have not done enough basic target following conditioning. It can also be that you are walking too slowly. Go back to kindergarten and practice some more or walk more briskly to develop sufficient momentum to get continued following on lure fade. Then try fading again. Make sure also that you pop up the heeling with the chatter the first few times you fade the target. Practice this exercise until you see some visible brightening up or increased intensity when you move the target up. This tells you he's made the connection. Now make the lure disappear altogether for 1 second, reinforcing immediately for continued following on faith. You can achieve the disappearance by closing your hand and moving it up to your shoulder or across your waist. Repeat this version until the dog demonstrates the same recognition that the lure disappearing altogether is a good thing. Once this is accomplished, start extending duration. From 1 second, go to 2 seconds, then 3, 4, and 5. As usual, drop the standard and go for shorter bursts if the dog falls apart and starts performing badly. In a few sessions, you should be able to go without a lure for 10 or 15 seconds per reinforcer, with the dog riveted in position. Making sits automatic. The most efficient way to install automatic sits is to heel the dog with frequent holds. The initial sequence is as follows. 1. Stop walking, and 2. Hand signal the dog to sit near a wall or barrier if he's a butt-out swinger. Your eventual goal is for the sensation of walking to become the sit cue. This is why it comes first. Avoid the common error of prompting or signaling the dog before you hold or as you hold. If you do this, the known hand gesture will block the event you are trying to establish as a cue. You're coming to a halt. The correct order of events, halt then hand signal, may cause the dog to continue past the point at which you stopped. Don't panic and fall into the trap of preemptively cueing a sit before halting. It is tempting to do so because it seems to solve the problem. Actually, it is merely postponing the problem to the inevitable day when you want the dog to sit for cessation of walking alone. Cessation of walking must, therefore, come first in the sequence if it is to ever be established. So the solution is to get your prompt in with some urgency as soon as you have stopped walking, to reduce the overshooting. If you're doing a series of sits, selectively reinforce those sits which are in better position. When the dog is no longer overshooting on halts and his sits are relatively well positioned, start fading the hand signal. Start off with a series of halts and signals as usual, reinforcing the nicest sits. Then, after halting, try a smaller hand signal for the sit and see if you get one. If you do, reinforce. If you don't get a sit, give your broader signal, but don't reinforce the sit thus produced. Then repeat the exercise. If the dog is consistently failing to sit for your faded signal, try a less faded signal, something between what works and what doesn't. Try a verbal if he's got a good one. Then say it more and more softly. You are searching for a new standard. The goal is to fade the hand signal or verbal to nothing. A lot of dogs pick up automatic sits very readily, partly because sit is such a strong behavior to start with. If the dog doesn't catch on quickly, fade systematically. If the dog is a crooked sitter, use your barrier prompt all the time you're working on getting the sit automatic. Only when it is very fluent will you wean off your straight sit prompt wall. When you do, don't panic if the automatic sits gets a little wobbly. It'll come back. This is why dog training is so much like juggling. High school healing. The goal now is to extend lure-free healing up to a minute per reinforcement. To maintain quality control over this duration, you will initially use your voice liberally. Build duration in increments of a few seconds. If the dog is riveted, add a few more. As duration grows in the exercise, remain very aware of exactly what you're clicking. Trainers quickly fall into the trap of thinking they are reinforcing the healing as a whole when they click and treat, but in reality, the click is selecting a particular moment of healing. This is particularly troublesome when one pushes the dog past the point of destruction. The dog's performance starts to deteriorate, and the trainer clicks and treats to regain the dog's interest. This common error results in reinforcement going to exactly what you don't want: poorer healing. Get in the habit of clicking the nice instance and noting what durations between reinforcers he can tolerate with razor-sharp precision. If position starts to deteriorate, it is a reflection of lackluster voice prompting, selective reinforcement of inferior moments, and a too low rate of reinforcement. Reinforce before deterioration sets in. If the dog consistently deteriorates right after reinforcement, that is an indication that you are reinforcing in a too predictable way, and likely not frequently enough. As duration grows, occasionally click and treat 2 or 3 times, almost back to back, to counteract the post-reinforcement blahs. When he's up to a minute, lure free and sharp. You may start healing the dog in less quiet locations. When you first do this, drop the duration requirement considerably, still using your voice to encourage. Build duration back gradually. College healing, no prompt. When the dog heals nicely for at least a minute for verbal encouragement, only a no food target, the next task is to fade the voice. This is an optional step if you do not intend to compete in licensed obedience trials. In these events, the dog is expected to heal for durations of around a minute at a time with no feedback from the handler. To achieve this, gradually fade the verbal coaching, selectively reinforcing after increasingly long stretches of good healing without this prompt. Then take it on the road to proof location changes and various flavors of ambient distraction. If your goal is to compete, be sure to use obedience fun matches as one of your main training locations. Not surprisingly, fun matches afford the best simulation of the location where you will most want nice responses. Obedience. Trials. This doesn't mean you necessarily have to enter the first couple of times. Simply hang out and train. The main goal is for the dog to learn this location predicts the usual reinforcer contingencies. A frequent error is prematurely entering obedience trials where the rules forbid feedback from handler to dog. Good performance goes completely unreinforced. Imperfections in performance are not worked on. There's no difference between great and terrible healing. It's all unreinforced. Performance drifts inevitably under this contingency. It is as though the dog asks himself, what's different? Why no reinforcement? And the resounding answer is, this context is different, which includes giveaway elements like the presence of other dogs, nervous people milling around, and people with corsages who are carrying clipboards, barking out commands like forward, etc. Dogs discriminate environmental differences with great ease, and the context of a dog show can quickly come to equate no contingencies in effect. Competitors label dogs like this ring-wise. Many assume some malicious intent on the part of the dog, rather than accepting the predictable, inevitable, and mundane learning phenomenon of operant discrimination. The contingencies are, indeed, different in an obedience trial, and the dog, perfectly obedient to the laws of learning, will perform accordingly. That is, unless he is never allowed to perceive the lack of contingency. This means 1. Loss of training not performing in the context, and 2. Entering trials only when the dog's performance is extremely tight and on a thin enough reinforcement schedule that the minimal damage will be done to the behaviors by the feedback-free experience. Obedience trials can be very damaging. The worst thing is that once the dog has learned that the obedience ring is a place where reinforcement never happens, all subsequent work will be affected, even if performance is made slick outside the ring. This goes for any performance situation where the feedback density changes, not just obedient trials. Dogs discriminate context variations and their associated contingencies brilliantly. You can make this work for you or against you. Tug toy motivators. Tug toys can spice up healing quite splendidly in dogs that are high drive. Introduce tug toy motivators if you haven't already. Before proceeding, review the rules of tug and teach them if you haven't. When you use tug to reinforce nice turns and healing, a great recall or lighting fast drop, produce a hidden tug toy from your pocket or up your shirt, and engage in a brief round of tug of war. Keep it brief. This means a few seconds only. The idea is to keep him ultra motivated. Longer tug sessions are reserved for 2 occasions: when the dog really hits the jackpot with some wondrous response, or when you're ending the training session, a fun time for an extra large reinforcer. The reasons for adding tug toy motivation to the arsenal include: 1. Varying reinforcers is always a good idea. Rotation preserves some novelty, plus the money effect of conditioning a secondary reinforcer, your clicker, to multiple primaries. 2. Many dogs work more enthusiastically for tug toys than for bait. For speed and intensity behaviors, it's a great choice. Food is better for precision. 3. The interactive game provides good bonding in the form of cooperative killing. 4. It's a great energy burner for the dog. 5. It provides an opportunity to improve control of your dog, especially his jaws, when he's in an excited state. The mechanics of dispensing a tug toy reinforcer during healing take practice. Try stashing it in your shirt, in your dog's side armpit, and in your other hand. Select a moment of excellence. Click and produce the toy. It's crafty to give the toy to the dog in position that his eventual toy grab anticipation will work to solidify rather than undermine positioning. Play a few seconds of intense tug, then cycle back into healing. Competing motivation. A dog with a strong and well-generalized response to a particular cue who is normally very motivated by food and tug games may fall apart under certain conditions. Stress can make behavior fall apart. A much more common interference is competing motivation. The dog hears and understands the cue, but something else in the environment potently reinforces an alternative behavior. Your bait and tug toy are losing out to dog play or the trail of a rabbit in the woods. What do? The first line of defense is to make the behaviors you want strong: recalls, downs, stays, etc., and to rehearse them in areas with gradually increased distraction. In the case of recalls, go the added distance of proofing for competing motivation as described earlier. If you'd like to bump other behaviors up to the level of withstanding strong competing motivation, the same principle, that of making the thing he wants to do contingent on first doing the behavior you're asking for, is a good tool to understand. This is Premack's principle. The first thing is to understand that there is always a hierarchy of reinforcers and that it's useful to label them as activities rather than things. What I mean is that rather than saying rabbit trails are more reinforcing than food, so he didn't do his downstay in the field, say hunting rabbits is currently a preferred activity to downstay. Now, in those cases where you are willing and able to grant the activity that he wants most to do, he can do that activity provided he does the other activity. The obedience one you want first. This is known to children as eat your broccoli to get your ice cream. His access to rabbit trails, dog playmates, etc. is contingent on his snappy response to obedience cues. Dogs fail to comply around competing motivations because the best way to get the things at the top of the reinforcer hierarchy has always been to simply access them directly. The behaviors you want would get in the way, delay or preempt altogether. The preferred activity, this is where you must prove the dog wrong. Not only does the dog's downstay not interfere with the dog's access to the rabbit trails, it becomes the only way the dog may obtain access to rabbit trails. You must, therefore, resolve to set things up so that he is unable to engage in these super high-value reinforcing activities unless he has earned them. If you say sit and the dog ignores you, carries on sniffing, or running toward another dog, explode into action. Get yourself quickly to the scene of the crime. Cut him off at the pass, and prevent or cut short the activity. Vow to set it up next time so you can prevent him more elegantly. For example, have a leash on. Failure to do this means the dog directly accesses the reinforcer at the top of the hierarchy for engaging in the direct access strategy. This is not good. You must go to training DEFCON 1 and build a program to teach the dog that the world doesn't operate this way. Performing requested behaviors on cue makes you say things like, go see the dog, or find rabbits. Trying to access these things directly gets nothing or worse, makes walks end. Simply be prepared to put your money where your mouth is. If you're out on a walk and ask for a sit before going to greet a person or dog down the block and the dog simply wiggles and pulls, say, too bad, and walk away in the other direction. You don't have to let him do anything, including greet people or dogs. If you rehearse this enough, the dog gets the picture. No anger, no frustration, just a simple rule. Comply and you get the good stuff dogs like. Don't comply and you don't get them. Dog's choice. If you give the dog this choice, he will comply, no matter what else is out there, because you are exploiting rather than competing with the reinforcer hierarchy. You are using the laws of learning to which he is always, without exception, perfectly obedient. PhD suggested dissertations. If you want a greater challenge, here are some suggested postgraduate projects, the nuts and bolts of which you may work out for yourself based on the same principles you've used up to now. Random position changes at 30 feet for verbal-only cue in a distracting environment. First cue discrimination of 10 to 20 verbal cues. 10-minute sit or down stay with a handler out of sight, spying, and heavy distraction. Healing with no food or verbal prompts through distracting environments. Final note. If you have not already done so, please spay or neuter your dog.